The courtroom was silent except for the faint ticking of an old clock. In the back row sat Emily Carter, wife of decorated Navy SEAL John Carter. She looked fragile but composed, her service dog Coda sitting alert by her side. Nobody expected her to speak, let alone act. But when the opposing lawyer tried to undermine her testimony, Emily bent slightly, whispered something barely audible into Coda's ear, and the dog stood, performed an action no one could have imagined. The judge froze, the jury gasped, and the room fell into stunned silence. What happened next would change the case, and the lives of everyone in that courtroom. Forever. John Carter's name was whispered with the kind of reverence reserved for legends. In the Navy SEAL community, he was a man who had done it all: high-risk reconnaissance missions, hostage rescues, and deep cover operations most civilians would never hear about. But in the quiet suburbs of Virginia Beach, away from the sound of rotor blades and gunfire, John was simply a husband, and that was the role he cherished most. Emily Carter had met John in a hospital in Ramstein, Germany, where she was working as a trauma nurse. He was fresh off a classified deployment, limping from a fractured rib and a wound that had nearly cost him his life. Emily remembered the first time she saw him, sitting upright on the gurney, refusing pain medication, his face stoic, but his eyes gentle. He thanked every nurse by name. When she adjusted his IV, he asked her how she was doing. That moment stuck with her long after her shift ended. Their connection deepened over months of emails, phone calls, and the kind of late-night conversations that stitched two strangers together. By the time John returned stateside, they were inseparable. She learned to live with the secrecy of his work, the quiet days punctuated by sudden deployments. He learned to appreciate her patience, her grounding presence, and her refusal to let him become a ghost of his own missions. They married in a small ceremony under a live oak tree at a friend's farm. No frills, no photographers, just vows whispered into the wind. Standing beside them, tail wagging and eyes sharp, was Coda, a Belgian Malinois who had once served alongside John overseas. Coda had been more than a partner in the field. He had been John's anchor. When John left the SEAL teams, he adopted Coda under a special veterans program. The dog transitioned from war zones to backyards with uncanny ease, but never lost the alertness that made him special. Coda wasn't an ordinary dog. He had been trained to detect explosives, track individuals over vast distances, and respond to more than 50 advanced commands, many of them silent or whispered. John sometimes joked that Coda was the third member of their marriage. Emily didn't mind. The dog's loyalty mirrored her own. In time, Coda learned to respond to Emily just as instinctively as he did to John. Their life together wasn't without shadows. The constant moving, the unpredictability, the lingering effects of John's deployments, nightmares that shook him awake, scars that never quite healed, all became part of their shared world. Emily built a quiet strength around it. She kept the house orderly, meals warm, and her own career flexible so she could follow him wherever orders sent them. When John retired, they thought the storm was over. But within a year, an incident shattered their fragile peace. John had been accused of wrongdoing during a mission in a foreign country, charges that seemed absurd to anyone who knew him. A contractor had died, and an opportunistic prosecutor claimed John exceeded his authority. The Navy launched an inquiry, but the civilian court system picked it up after pressure from an international watchdog group. Suddenly, John Carter, decorated war hero, was facing a trial that could ruin his life. Emily became his anchor. While his legal team built a defense, she juggled her own job and the crushing weight of public scrutiny. News crews camped outside their home. Anonymous threats appeared in her inbox. But she didn't break. She had been trained in her own way. Not by the military, but by years of loving someone who had seen combat up close. She also had Coda. The dog sensed tension before anyone else. When Emily's hands trembled reading a new headline, Coda pressed his head against her leg until she calmed. When strangers approached their door, Coda's stance shifted subtly, never aggressive, but always on alert. Emily realized she felt safest when Coda was near. John's trial became a national spectacle. Veterans groups rallied on his behalf. Pundits debated the ethics of his mission. But Emily knew the truth. John had saved lives that day, not ended them unjustly. The real danger lay in forces that wanted him silenced, and in a courtroom that didn't understand the reality of war. As the trial date approached, Emily prepared for her testimony. She would be called as a character witness, perhaps more. She was nervous but determined. John had risked everything for his country. She could risk a few days on the stand for him, but she also knew that the courtroom would be hostile. The prosecutor had already tried to paint her as complicit, suggesting she knew of classified details she shouldn't. Her lawyer warned her to expect a grueling cross-examination. The morning of the trial, she dressed carefully in a navy blue suit, pinned her hair back, and looked in the mirror. Her reflection startled her. She looked more like a soldier than the man on trial. When she stepped out of the bedroom, Coda padded to her side, head level with her hip, his harness secured. She crouched, stroked his ears, and whispered, "We'll be okay." Coda blinked, understanding more than most people would think. Outside, cameras flashed as they walked to the car. Reporters shouted questions about her husband, about Coda, about her own credibility. She ignored them. In the parking lot of the courthouse, she took one last deep breath before entering a building where her life, and John's, might change forever. Inside the courthouse, marble columns loomed over polished floors. The air smelled faintly of old books and coffee. Emily felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her as she approached the defense table. John was already seated, his face stoic, but his eyes softening when they met hers. He squeezed her hand. For the first time in weeks, she saw a flicker of the man she had married. Not the accused, not the headline, but her husband. Coda settled at her feet, perfectly still, except for the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. His ears flicked at every sound, a pen scratching, a throat clearing, a gavel striking wood. The judge glanced at the dog, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Service animals were allowed, but Coda's bearing was unusual, not merely calm, but commanding. As opening statements began, Emily's heart pounded. She thought of the long nights writing affidavits, the endless strategy sessions with lawyers, the whispered reassurances to John when he doubted himself. She thought of how far they had come, from a hospital gurney in Germany to this courtroom in Virginia. And she thought of the quiet commands John had taught her, the ones she'd practiced when no one was watching. Commands meant not for show, but for protection. She had never imagined needing them in a courtroom. But as she looked at the prosecutor's steely expression and the judge's skeptical gaze, she wondered if those commands might one day save more than just her husband's reputation. They might save lives. The courtroom was more than just a room. It was a stage. Every polished surface reflected tension. Every whisper carried the weight of judgment. The federal courthouse in Norfolk had hosted spies, smugglers, and politicians, but never before a decorated Navy SEAL accused of war crimes on home soil. That morning, the benches were packed with journalists, veterans in uniform, curious citizens, and a handful of protesters carrying placards outside. Emily sat at the defense table, spine straight despite the heaviness in her stomach. Beside her, John's legal team arranged their papers with the precision of surgeons. Across the aisle, the prosecution looked equally prepared. Their lead attorney, Martin Reeves, a tall man with an unflappable demeanor, scrolling through notes on a tablet. He had a reputation for dismantling witnesses with surgical precision. Judge Harrington presided over it all like a hawk perched on a marble branch. Silver-haired, eyes sharp, he was known for being unimpressed by theatrics and equally unimpressed by military heroics. His courtroom was an arena of facts, not sentiment. If Emily hoped for leniency, she would find none here. Yet something about the judge's posture suggested curiosity. The kind of guarded interest of a man who'd seen many things but sensed this case might be different. Coda lay at Emily's feet, his weight a steadying anchor. His fur brushed against her shoes as he breathed evenly, yet his ears were high and taut, swiveling toward each sound. The service vest he wore bore 2 patches, one reading, "Service Dog, Do Not Disturb," and another, smaller, sewn on by John himself, that simply said, "Loyalty." Emily kept her hand near Coda's shoulder, a quiet point of contact. The dog's presence had already drawn murmurs in the gallery. Most service dogs were calm but somewhat disengaged. Coda, on the other hand, had the posture of a sentinel, Even Judge Harrington had raised an eyebrow during the opening proceedings. He hadn't said anything yet, but Emily noticed his eyes flick toward the dog more than once. As the trial opened that day, Reeves launched into a blistering narrative about the misuse of military power. He described John Carter as a man who had taken the law into his own hands during an operation in a desert village overseas. He called it vigilantism in uniform. The word stung Emily's ears. She glanced at John, who stared straight ahead, jaw tight, hands clasped on the table. Not a single muscle twitched, but Emily knew him well enough to see the storm building behind his stillness. The defense countered with its own opening, framing John as a hero who had prevented an ambush, saved Allied lives, and followed his orders under impossible conditions. The clash of narratives was almost physical. Even the gallery shifted, leaning forward, as if watching a boxing match. By mid-morning, the courtroom had become a crucible. Every word echoed against the high ceiling, every shuffle of paper amplified by the hush. Emily felt her heart in her throat. She wasn't testifying yet, but she knew Reeves was building toward her, laying the groundwork to attack her credibility, her marriage, even her character. Coda shifted slightly, a near-invisible adjustment. Emily recognized it immediately. He'd caught the scent of stress, his version of reading a room. She gave a tiny, deliberate stroke along his back, a signal they'd practiced. He eased again, though his eyes never left the prosecutor. The judge called for the first witness, a former contractor who had been on site during the operation. As the man spoke, his testimony painted John as reckless, even vengeful. Emily clenched her fists under the table. She had read the after-action reports, had heard John's version, had lived through his sleepless nights. This portrayal wasn't just inaccurate, it was malicious. Her breath came shallow, but she kept her face calm. Halfway through the morning session, Judge Harrington called a brief recess. The gavel echoed like a gunshot. As the lawyers dispersed into side conversations, Emily remained seated. She leaned down to Coda, whispering a word only he knew. Instantly, the dog rose, stretched, and sat again. To the casual observer, it was nothing. But to Emily, it was reassurance. A tiny ritual that helped her reset before the storm resumed. When the court reconvened, Reeves changed tactics. He began hinting at financial irregularities, trying to link Emily to some kind of cover-up. He asked leading questions about her role in handling John's emails, his bank accounts, his travel arrangements. It was a tactic designed to rattle her before she even took the stand. Judge Harrington finally interjected. "Mr. Reeves," he said, voice even but edged with steel, "let's remember Mrs. Carter is not on trial today." Reeves inclined his head but didn't retreat. Emily could feel the jury's eyes flick to her, could sense their unspoken questions. Her pulse quickened. Under the table, Coda's body stiffened, a living barrier between her and the room. She thought about the training sessions in their backyard. John teaching her the quiet commands. A touch on the collar meant stay close. A whispered word meant retrieve. A glance meant guard. Coda could do things no ordinary dog could. Not out of aggression, but out of discipline. Emily had never used these commands in public. But she remembered John's voice. "If you're ever threatened, don't hesitate. Coda's got you." As the afternoon wore on, tension spooled tighter. Reeves prepared to call Emily as a witness sooner than expected. The defense attorney leaned in to whisper to her, but Emily barely heard. Her focus was on Coda, on the steady weight of his head near her foot, on the knowledge that she wasn't entirely defenseless. Judge Harrington watched too, though he betrayed nothing. His pen tapped the bench lightly, the only sign of thought. By the time court adjourned for the day, the stage was set. Reeves had painted John as dangerous and Emily as suspicious. The jury was divided but attentive. The defense planned to hit back tomorrow, but Emily knew the hardest part lay ahead, her own testimony. She would face Reeves's questions directly, with cameras rolling, with headlines waiting to be written. As she gathered her papers, Coda rose smoothly, positioning himself between Emily and the crowd leaving the gallery. The dog's precision was almost military, a sidestep to block an onlooker who came too close, a glance upward to check her face. Emily gave him a small nod. They walked out together, a quiet pair moving through a storm of flashing cameras and murmured speculation. What no one in that building realized yet, not Reeves, not the judge, not even John, was that Emily carried more than just the truth of her husband's innocence. She carried the secret training embedded in Coda, a silent code that could alter the course of the trial in an instant. And as the courthouse doors shut behind them, Emily began to sense that she might need it sooner than she'd ever imagined. The quiet hum of cicadas filled the Virginia dusk. Emily stood barefoot in the backyard, the grass cool under her toes, as Coda crouched low to the ground, his muscles rippling under his coat. John stood a few paces away, arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Again," he said. Emily exhaled slowly, lowering herself to one knee. "Coda," she whispered, then added a soft word, one of the coded signals John had taught her. The dog rose silently, padded to the patio table, and retrieved a small canvas pouch, carrying it back with careful precision. "Good boy," Emily murmured, stroking Coda's head. The dog's tail flicked once, restrained even in his excitement. When John had first proposed teaching her the quiet commands, Emily had balked. "You're turning me into a soldier," she'd teased. But she'd also known it wasn't a game. As a trauma nurse, she'd seen the aftermath of violence. As a SEAL's wife, she'd lived with the constant low-level threat of being targeted. Stalkers, protesters, even people who resented the military. John hadn't insisted, but he'd offered. She'd accepted. The training started with basics. Hand signals, one-word cues. Sit, stay, guard. Then it escalated. Retrieve hidden objects, differentiate between friend and foe, respond to emergency triggers. Coda's intelligence stunned her. He learned new commands after only a few repetitions, his gaze always locked on hers like he understood more than words. John supervised every session with the meticulousness of a sniper lining up a shot. "He's not a weapon," he reminded her. "He's a protector. You're a team." They practiced in daylight, then at night. They practiced in silence, in wind, under the cover of thunderstorms. Emily learned to trust her instincts, and Coda's. Over time, the commands became muscle memory. A touch at her wrist meant Coda should circle behind her. A whispered phrase meant retrieve evidence. Another phrase meant create a diversion, something as subtle as nudging an object off a table or barking once to draw attention. But the most important command was the quietest of all: watch. When Emily gave that word, Coda's entire demeanor shifted. He became a sentinel, eyes scanning, nostrils flaring, every muscle taut but restrained. On one training night, Emily asked John, "Why all this? We're home now." John didn't answer immediately. He stared at the tree line as if seeing some distant memory. "Because the world doesn't stop being dangerous just because we came home," he said finally. "And because I won't always be there." The words sank into Emily's chest like a stone. She reached for Coda, burying her fingers in his fur. The dog pressed closer, warm and steady. Over the months, their little backyard sessions built an invisible net of confidence. Emily went about her daily life with a subtle awareness, not paranoia, but readiness. When John was away for meetings or legal hearings, she felt Coda's presence as both shield and companion. He wasn't just John's dog anymore. He was hers too. As the trial loomed, they added one last layer to the training: document retrieval. Emily practiced hiding a flash drive or a folded piece of paper in obscure places, then signaling Coda to fetch it. He could slip through a room like a shadow, nose guiding him, jaws gentle enough to hold fragile items. John's lawyers had joked about dog ex machina when Emily described it. She only smiled. She hoped she'd never have to use it. But as she sat in the courthouse during those first days of testimony, she felt the training like a hum under her skin. The commands weren't just words. They were options, lifelines. She didn't know what Reeves had planned, but she sensed it wouldn't be fair. The night after the first day of trial, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, John asleep beside her. Coda lay at the foot of the bed, eyes half open. She whispered one of the codes softly, and Coda's ears flicked. He rose, padded to her side, and rested his head on the mattress. She stroked his muzzle. "You're ready, aren't you?" she whispered. Coda blinked, silent, but steady. She remembered John's voice from months before. "If you're ever backed into a corner, don't panic. Coda's not just a dog. He's proof of everything we stand for. He'll protect you. Trust him." Emily rolled onto her side, her palm on Coda's head, and finally closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would be called to the stand. Tomorrow the courtroom would become more than a place of testimony. It might become a battlefield, one fought not with weapons, but with discipline, truth, and a dog trained to guard more than lives. The third day of trial dawned with a winter sky the color of steel. Emily buttoned her navy suit with hands that trembled only slightly. Coda sat at her heel, watching, tail still. She felt like she was preparing for deployment rather than testimony. When she bent to clip his vest, the smell of his fur grounded her more than any breathing exercise ever had. The courthouse was already humming when she arrived. Veterans in faded ball caps nodded as she passed. Journalists raised their cameras. Inside, the courtroom was thick with anticipation. John gave her a quick, firm squeeze of the hand before she walked to the witness stand. The bailiff held out a Bible. Emily placed her hand on it, swore to tell the truth, and took her seat. Reeves rose slowly from the prosecution table. He wore the faint smile of a chess player moving in for a checkmate. "Mrs. Carter," he began, "you've been married to the defendant for 7 years?" "Yes," Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And during that time, you've had full access to his emails, his financial records, and his personal effects?" "Not full access," she corrected quietly. "We have a marriage, not a surveillance arrangement." A few chuckles broke out in the gallery. Reeves's smile thinned. He began pacing slowly, reading from his notes. He asked about John's deployments, about the night of the incident overseas, about what she'd known and when she'd known it. His tone was courteous, but the rhythm of his questioning was designed to box her in. Emily breathed evenly. Under the table, she could see the tip of Coda's tail resting against her shoe. The dog sat perfectly aligned with her chair, his gaze fixed not on Reeves but on Emily's face, reading her micro-movements, waiting for signals. After 20 minutes of routine questioning, Reeves pivoted. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "are you aware of large sums of money transferred to an account in your name shortly after the operation?" Emily blinked. "Large sums?" "Yes. 2 separate deposits totaling $40,000. "That was an insurance settlement from an accident at my hospital," she said firmly. Reeves tilted his head, as though unconvinced. "You're sure it wasn't a payment to conceal information?" A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrington rapped his gavel once. Sustained. "Move on, Mr. Reeves." But Reeves didn't. He began a line of questioning about her interactions with the media, about Coda, about whether she had trained her husband's service dog to deliver contraband. Emily felt her cheeks heat. She thought she'd prepared for everything, but this insinuation was grotesque. Her lawyer objected again. The judge sustained again but allowed Reeves one last question, relevant to the defendant's character. Reeves took his time, letting silence stretch. "Mrs. Carter," he said at last, "isn't it true you learned to use covert signals and hand gestures with the defendant's military dog?" The gallery gasped softly. Emily's pulse slammed in her ears. She pictured John's hands covering hers during those backyard sessions, pictured the careful way Coda fetched the canvas pouch. Reeves had no proof, but even the question alone could poison the jury's view. She steadied her breathing. "It's true," she said evenly, "that as the spouse of a veteran, I learned basic commands to help care for his service animal." "That's all," Reeves pounced. "Basic commands or coded commands?" Emily refused to look away. "Service dogs respond to a variety of cues. Anyone in my position would do the same." For a moment, silence reigned. Then Reeves leaned on the witness stand, lowering his voice so it carried like a whisper. "Would you be willing to demonstrate these commands for the court?" Her attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a courtroom, not a training ground." Judge Harrington frowned, weighing the moment. "Mr. Reeves, you are straying perilously close to spectacle." Reeves lifted his hands. I'm simply trying to assess the credibility of her testimony. Emily's heart hammered. This was the ambush John had warned her about. A request to put Coda on display, to make him seem like a prop. She glanced at the dog. Coda remained still, ears forward, awaiting her cue. The judge turned to her. Mrs. Carter, you're not required to comply. Do you wish to? Emily swallowed. Her mouth was dry. She thought about the hours of practice, the whispered codes, the tiny repertoire of movements only she and John knew. Demonstrating any of it in open court would strip away their one advantage. But refusing could make her seem evasive. I'd prefer not to, she said finally. Judge Harrington nodded once. Very well. The witness is not compelled. Reeves's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned back to his table, rifling his notes. But Emily could see the satisfaction flicker in his eyes. He'd planted the idea. The jury would remember. When the judge called a recess, Emily rose on shaking legs. Coda stood instantly, positioning himself at her side as she left the stand. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she leaned against the cool marble wall, eyes closed. John's lawyer joined her. He's trying to rattle you, he said softly. Don't give him more than he's already got. Emily nodded, but felt a tremor run through her. He knows about the commands. He doesn't know what they do, the lawyer said. That's the difference. She crouched to stroke Coda's ears. The dog pressed his head against her knee, warm and solid. She whispered a phrase, one of the quiet codes, and Coda sat straighter, eyes sweeping the corridor. She'd never needed these commands outside their backyard, but today had been a warning. She might have to soon. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The jury had seen a hint of something unusual, though they didn't yet understand it. Judge Harrington, too, had begun to look at Emily differently. Not with contempt, but with curiosity, as though trying to fit a puzzle piece into place. As proceedings adjourned for the day, Reeves announced he would call a new surprise witness tomorrow. Emily caught the glint in his eyes. This wasn't over. The cross-examination had been only the opening salvo. Tomorrow, something bigger was coming. And she and Coda would need to be ready. She left the courthouse with John at her side and Coda in step. The three of them a quiet formation moving through the crowd of flashing cameras. Emily kept her head high, but inside she could feel the countdown ticking toward an inevitable confrontation. One in which a whispered command might be the only thing standing between justice and disaster. Morning light streamed through the courthouse windows like thin gold bars. Emily could feel the tension before she even entered the building. Reporters swarmed the steps, their voices rising with questions about yesterday's revelation and the mysterious dog. Veterans groups held up signs reading, "Stand with Carter." Somewhere in the crowd, a protester shouted insults, but Coda never even flicked an ear. He walked at Emily's side with the unshakable calm of a soldier. Inside, the atmosphere felt denser than air before a storm. John's team whispered urgently at the defense table. Emily could see their shoulders tight, their eyes scanning their notes. Reeves sat across the aisle, uncharacteristically still, his face a mask of focus. In front of him lay a small hard drive in an evidence bag. Emily's stomach turned. This had to be the surprise witness moment. Judge Harrington entered promptly at 9. His gavel fell once. Proceed, Reeves rose. Your Honor, the prosecution calls Officer Gerald Beckett to the stand. A bailiff escorted a broad-shouldered security contractor into the room. Beckett's jaw was clenched, his eyes darting toward John with a flicker of unease. Emily recognized him. He'd been at the overseas base the night of the operation. He was also, according to John's whispers, the man who'd forged the reports. Reeves began his questioning with an almost conversational tone. Beckett testified that John Carter had acted aggressively and exceeded his orders. He produced a supposed recording from the night in question, the hard drive, which Reeves claimed had been recently authenticated. Emily's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the exhibit pending verification. As the recording began to play, Emily's heart hammered. A grainy audio file filled the courtroom with muffled shouting, gunfire, and a voice resembling John's giving an order to eliminate all targets. It was damning. John sat stone-faced. Emily glanced at him and saw the muscle in his jaw flicker. He whispered something to his lawyer. The lawyer paled. Beckett smirked slightly from the witness stand. He'd done this before. Emily could see the confidence in his posture. But something about his behavior was off. She remembered a detail from John's late-night worries. About a flash drive Beckett had hidden. One that could prove the recording had been doctored. And then it hit her. They had trained for this exact scenario. The pouch, the retrieval command, Coda. Her pulse spiked. She leaned slightly, whispering so softly she could barely hear herself. Coda's ears twitched. On the stand, Beckett was saying, "This recording clearly shows the defendant's intent." Emily whispered the quiet command. It was only 2 syllables, but it carried every hour of training in its sound. Coda rose silently from under the table and moved with the fluidity of a shadow. The gallery murmured. The judge raised his eyebrows. "Mrs. Carter," Judge Harrington began, "control your—" But Coda was already moving. Without hesitation, he trotted past the defense table, past the rows of spectators, toward the back of the courtroom, directly to Beckett's coat hanging on a hook near the bailiff. With delicate precision, Coda nosed into the inner pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive sealed in plastic. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Coda padded back to Emily, sat, and dropped the drive into her palm. "Your Honor," Emily said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This is the evidence my husband's accuser concealed." The room erupted. Reeves shouted for order, objecting loudly. Beckett's face drained of color. Judge Harrington rapped his gavel until the echoes died. "Bailiff," the judge said, "take custody of that item immediately." The bailiff approached, eyes wide, and took the flash drive from Emily. He handed it to a court clerk, who slid it into a secure evidence bag. The judge leaned forward, eyes like steel drills on Beckett. "Mr. Beckett," he said slowly, "is there any reason a flash drive would be hidden in your coat?" Beckett stammered. I don't, that's not mine." The judge raised an eyebrow. "We'll see." Reeves tried to regain control. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defendant's wife cannot introduce evidence through a trained animal." Judge Harrington's voice cut him off. "What's outrageous, Mr. Reeves, is a witness concealing potential evidence during a federal trial." The clerk whispered to the judge after quickly scanning the flash drive on a secure laptop. Judge Harrington's eyebrows shot upward. He turned to the courtroom. "It appears," he said, his tone measured but charged, "that this drive contains unedited video footage from the operation in question. Footage contradicting the witness's testimony." The gallery erupted again. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Veterans whispered prayers of relief. Emily sat frozen, her hand on Coda's head. The dog looked up at her, eyes calm, as if to say mission complete. Judge Harrington signaled for silence. "We will take a 30-minute recess while this evidence is reviewed." The gavel fell like a thunderclap. The courtroom emptied in a buzz of disbelief. Emily stayed seated, her palm still resting on Coda's neck. John leaned close, whispering, "How did you—" She gave a tiny shake of her head. "Training," she murmured. "Your training!" John's lawyer crouched beside them. "You just changed the entire case," he whispered, awe in his eyes. "If this footage is real, it's real," John said flatly. "Beckett's been lying from the start." Emily stroked Coda's ears. For the first time since the trial began, she felt the weight in her chest ease. They'd taken a risk, a huge one, but it had worked. Coda had done what no human could, retrieved the truth from under their enemy's nose. Across the room, Beckett sat with his head in his hands, sweat beading on his forehead. Reeves stood beside him, gesturing sharply, but Beckett's eyes were unfocused, his lips moving silently. Judge Harrington watched from the bench, his expression unreadable. But Emily caught a flicker, not just surprise, but respect. As the bailiff signaled them to leave for recess, Emily rose, Coda at her side. The gallery parted silently, some reaching out to touch her arm, others simply staring at the dog who'd exposed a lie. John followed, his hand brushing hers. Outside in the corridor, Emily crouched to meet Coda's eyes. "Good boy," she whispered, her throat tight. Coda pressed his head against her shoulder. She felt John's hand on her back, steady and warm, In the distance, she could already hear the news anchors rehearsing their opening lines. The Navy SEAL's wife gives quiet command to her dog and shocks the courtroom. When court reconvened after the recess, the room felt utterly changed. The same marble pillars stood, the same high windows let in winter light, but the atmosphere had shifted from prosecution-driven confidence to a stunned, electric anticipation. People in the gallery leaned forward as though watching history unfold. Even the court reporter's fingers trembled slightly above the keyboard. Judge Harrington entered from his chambers carrying a thin folder and a flash drive sealed in a new evidence bag. His expression was still composed, but there was a weight to his movements, a deliberateness that made the air vibrate with tension. He settled at the bench, adjusted his glasses, and rapped the gavel once. "This court is now in session." Reeves stood immediately. "Your Honor, before we proceed—" "Sit down, Mr. Reeves," the judge said, not unkindly but with a firmness that brooked no argument. "You will have your chance." The gallery went utterly silent. Emily sat at the defense table, John beside her, Coda underfoot like a silent shadow. Her hand brushed the dog's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. She glanced at the jury box. Several jurors were watching her and Coda with a mix of awe and curiosity. Judge Harrington opened the folder, lifted a few typed pages, then looked over the rim of his glasses at Beckett. "Mr. Beckett, please stand." Beckett rose slowly from the witness stand. Sweat had darkened the collar of his shirt. "This court has reviewed the contents of the flash drive recovered from your personal effects," the judge continued. "It contains unedited footage from the operation at the center of this case. The footage directly contradicts several key statements you made under oath this morning." A collective inhale swept the gallery. Cameras clicked. Reeves paled but kept his expression neutral. "Mr. Beckett," the judge said, his voice steady but hard, "you are now in serious jeopardy of perjury charges." Beckett opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands trembled on the rail of the witness box. Reeves rose again. "Your Honor, we must consider the chain of custody." "The chain of custody," Judge Harrington said, "begins with you explaining why critical evidence was hidden in your coat pocket during sworn testimony." A murmur rippled through the gallery. John leaned toward his attorney, whispering something. Emily's pulse thrummed in her ears. She could feel Coda's muscles taut under her palm, as if the dog himself sensed the moment's importance. Judge Harrington turned his gaze to Emily. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I must address the unusual manner in which this evidence was produced." Emily rose, heart hammering. "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you train your service animal specifically to retrieve this flash drive?" "I trained him," she said carefully, "to retrieve objects for my husband and me. I did not know this flash drive was hidden here until today, but when I saw the witness and recalled my husband's concerns, I acted to safeguard what I believed might be evidence." The judge studied her for a long moment. "And you gave a verbal command?" "Yes, Your Honor." He leaned back, folding his hands. "I have presided over thousands of cases. I've seen theatrics, stunts, even brawls. But I have rarely seen a display of discipline and instinct quite like what occurred here today." A ripple of laughter, nervous, respectful, passed through the gallery. Emily felt her cheeks flush, but kept her eyes on the judge. "This court does not condone vigilantism or disruption," he continued. "However, it also does not condone the concealment of evidence." His gaze shifted back to Beckett. "Particularly when lives and reputations hang in the balance." Reeves cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a postponement to review this new—" "Denied," Judge Harrington said sharply. "The footage speaks for itself." He gestured to the court clerk. "Please display the unedited footage for the court." The lights dimmed slightly as a monitor flickered to life. The video began to play. A grainy but clear recording from a helmet camera, showing John's unit moving through the village under fire. Voices shouted, but John's voice was calm, issuing orders to evacuate civilians, not harm them. The entire sequence was a stark refutation of the doctored audio Reeves had introduced earlier. Jurors leaned forward, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the difference. One wiped at her eyes. Veterans in the gallery murmured prayers of relief. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a moment, stunned. When the footage ended, the judge's voice filled the silence. Mr. Reeves, based on this evidence, your case appears to rest on testimony and exhibits now proven unreliable. Do you wish to continue? Reeves's jaw flexed. Your Honor, the government will need to review. Judge Harrington leaned forward, his voice low but thunderous. You have had months to review this case. What you have presented to this court is a narrative built on altered evidence and a witness who has now been caught concealing exculpatory material. I am vacating all restrictions on the defense calling new witnesses and moving to dismiss any testimony from Mr. Beckett pending investigation. A stunned hush settled over the room. Emily felt John's hand find hers under the table. His fingers were warm, steady, a mirror of the dog pressed against her knee. Judge Harrington turned back to Emily. Mrs. Carter, your composure under pressure is noted. Your service animal's discipline is likewise commendable. This court will be making a formal inquiry into how this evidence was suppressed, but you may sit down. Emily sat, heart pounding. Coda lay back down, eyes still fixed on the front of the courtroom. She stroked his head, whispering a thank you no one else could hear. For the first time since the trial began, John smiled, a small, private smile at the corner of his mouth, the kind she remembered from their early days. You saved me, he whispered. No, Emily whispered back. We saved each other. As the gavel fell to adjourn for the day, Judge Harrington's final words echoed off the marble walls. Court will reconvene tomorrow to determine next steps. But let it be clear, this case has taken a dramatic turn. The gallery erupted as people stood, talking in hushed tones. Reporters darted for the exits to broadcast their headlines. Veterans clasped each other's shoulders, some with tears in their eyes. A handful of protesters quietly rolled up their signs. Emily rose, Coda at her side, John behind her. They moved through the throng like a small self-contained unit, the three of them held together by the invisible thread of what they'd endured. Outside, the winter air hit her lungs like a shock, but she felt light for the first time in months. Coda looked up at her as they stepped onto the courthouse steps. His eyes were dark and calm, reflecting the flash of cameras and the pale sky above. She crouched, wrapping her arms around him briefly. Good boy, she whispered. We're not done yet, but we're close. Coda's tail flicked once. Mission ongoing. The morning after the explosive court session, the courthouse plaza was unrecognizable. News vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes angled skyward. Reporters huddled in the cold, rehearsing their live intros. Headlines rolled across every screen. Seal's dog unmasks hidden evidence, and shock in court as witness exposed. Inside, security was doubled. Every bag was checked twice, every phone scanned. Emily could feel eyes on her as she walked through the metal detector with Coda at her side. The dog padded forward calmly, the picture of discipline. John followed, flanked by his attorney. The air buzzed with anticipation. The day the case would either crumble or fight back. Judge Harrington entered promptly at 9, gavel in hand, his expression as controlled as the day before but with an edge of impatience. We resume the case of the United States versus John Carter. Mr. Reeves, are you prepared? Reeves stood, his usually flawless posture slightly slumped. Your Honor, in light of yesterday's developments, the government must reassess. Begin reassessing by explaining to this court, the judge cut in, why critical evidence was hidden and doctored. All eyes turned to Reeves. For a moment, he seemed about to deflect, but then his gaze flicked to Beckett, seated beside a new attorney. Beckett's once confident demeanor had dissolved overnight. Now he looked like a man walking toward a firing squad. Emily sat rigid, one hand on Coda's collar. She knew the real story, or at least pieces of it. John had whispered fragments to her over sleepless nights. Shady contracts, back-channel deals, and Beckett's role in it all. But hearing it under oath would change everything. Judge Harrington signaled to the bailiff, "Bring Mr. Beckett back to the stand." Beckett rose slowly and walked to the witness box, the shuffle of his shoes echoing in the hushed courtroom. He swore the oath with a voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Beckett," the judge said, "you are now under investigation for perjury and obstruction. I advise you to answer truthfully." Beckett's new attorney leaned close, whispering urgently. Beckett swallowed hard and nodded. Reeves approached, a legal pad trembling slightly in his hand. Mr. Beckett, yesterday this court discovered unedited footage contradicting your testimony. Would you like to explain? Beckett's eyes darted to John, then to Emily, then back to the judge. His mouth opened and closed twice. Finally, he exhaled. It wasn't supposed to go this far. The gallery leaned in. Even the bailiff froze mid-step. Go on, Reeves prompted, his voice surprisingly gentle. Beckett rubbed his forehead. The orders to alter the footage didn't come from me. They came from the private security firm contracting with the Department of Defense. They wanted Carter blamed to protect themselves. The raid exposed their illegal arms deals with local warlords. If Carter looked like a rogue operator, it would bury the real story. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Emily's fingers tightened on Coda's fur. She glanced at John, whose expression remained steady, but his eyes burned. Judge Harrington's voice sliced through the room. You're telling this court that the evidence against the defendant was deliberately fabricated to shield a private contractor from criminal exposure. Beckett nodded miserably. They paid me to doctor the audio, to make it sound like Carter ordered civilians targeted. I was supposed to destroy the unedited footage. I couldn't do it. I kept a copy, the flash drive, as insurance. The judge's gavel struck once. Names, Mr. Beckett. Who ordered this? Beckett swallowed hard. Stonebridge Global Security, their regional director, Marcus Hale. They're the ones who... Reeves interjected. Your Honor, the witness is implicating a third party. Let him finish, Judge Harrington said sharply. Beckett went on. They pressured the prosecution to fast-track the trial, to keep Carter quiet. They thought with him in prison, no one would connect the dots. Emily's heart pounded. She remembered John mentioning Stonebridge once, late at night, voice low like he feared the walls might hear. And now it was coming out under oath. Judge Harrington leaned forward. Mr. Reeves, was the prosecution aware of this arrangement? Reeves's face turned a shade paler. Your Honor, I was not personally aware. Then you'd better start checking who in your office was, the judge thundered. The gallery erupted in murmurs. The judge rapped his gavel. Order. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus. He turned back to Beckett. You understand that by admitting this you are confessing to multiple felonies? Beckett nodded. Yes, Your Honor, but I can't carry it anymore. John's attorney rose. Your Honor, in light of this testimony, we move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client. The judge raised a hand. Motion taken under advisement. We'll recess for 1 hour while I consult with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Gavel. Boom. Done. In the hallway outside, the world was chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones swarmed. Veterans chanted John's name. Emily kept one hand on Coda's collar, the other clasping John's fingers as they pushed through the crowd. You okay? She whispered. John gave a grim smile. This is only the beginning. If Stonebridge goes down, they'll fight like hell. Coda's ears flicked at the noise, but he stayed calm, eyes scanning the crowd like a soldier on patrol. Emily crouched briefly to rub his neck. We're okay, she whispered. You did your job. Now it's our turn. Inside the courthouse cafeteria, John's attorney spread files across a table. This is a game changer, he said. If Beckett flips completely, the DOJ will have to open an investigation into Stonebridge. You might even walk free today. Emily stared out the window at the throng of reporters. And if Stonebridge decides to hit back? John met her eyes. Then we hit back harder, legally. No more shadows. Coda laid his head on Emily's lap, eyes half closed. She stroked his ears, feeling the quiet steadiness of the animal who had become the symbol of their fight for the truth. The Navy SEAL, his wife, and their dog, unlikely warriors against a billion-dollar machine. When court reconvened an hour later, Judge Harrington's expression was grimmer but resolute. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at John. Mr. Carter, he said, this court finds substantial evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and fabricated evidence. All charges against you are hereby dismissed without prejudice. You are free to go. The gallery erupted into cheers. Veterans rose to their feet, clapping and shouting John's name. Reporters rushed the aisle. Emily's knees went weak with relief. She turned to John, tears in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. John shook his head slightly. "Not over. But today we won." Coda barked once, a short, sharp sound that cut through the noise like a seal of approval. Emily crouched to hug him, her tears falling into his fur. Judge Harrington banged his gavel again. "This court is adjourned." Outside, the courthouse steps had become a stage. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded forward. John raised a hand. "No statements today," he said firmly. "This is about justice, not headlines." Emily stood beside him, Coda at her side. She could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes, but also their admiration. This wasn't just their story anymore. It belonged to everyone who'd been silenced, framed, or betrayed. As they descended the steps, John leaned close. "We're going after Stonebridge," he whispered. "But this time on our terms." Emily nodded. "We'll be ready." Coda trotted beside them, tail flicking once, eyes scanning for threats. Mission ongoing, but for the first time in months, the path ahead felt clear. Snow fell lightly over Washington, D.C. the morning after the trial ended. The courthouse steps that had been a frenzy of media the day before now stood mostly empty, save for a few camera crews filming stand-ups for the evening news. The case of United States versus John Carter had been dismissed, but the ripples were only beginning. Emily woke before dawn in the small apartment they'd rented near the courthouse. For the first time in months, she'd slept more than 2 hours straight. John was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in a plain hoodie, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. Coda lay at his feet, snoring softly. "You didn't sleep?" she asked. "Not much," he said. "After a year of being hunted, it's hard to switch off." She poured herself coffee and sat across from him. They stared at each other for a moment, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of everything they'd survived. "You're free," she said finally. John gave a faint smile. "Free for now. Stonebridge won't go quietly." Coda stirred at the sound of his name in her thoughts, stretching and placing his head on Emily's knee. She scratched behind his ears. "We're still together," she murmured. "That's what matters." By mid-morning, they were on the road back to their home base in Virginia. A convoy of veterans' motorcycles escorted them out of the city, flags snapping in the wind. Drivers honked and waved. A trucker rolled down his window and shouted, "We're with you, brother!" John lifted a hand in acknowledgement, a small smile flickering across his face. At a gas station an hour outside the city, Emily checked her phone. Every news network had the same headline: "Hero SEAL Vindicated. Dog Helps Uncover Conspiracy." Social media was ablaze with photos of Coda retrieving the flash drive. Someone had already turned it into a meme. "Good boy brings receipts." John watched over her shoulder. "He's famous," he said. Coda always wanted an agent, Emily teased. And for the first time in months, they both laughed. Back at their quiet suburban neighborhood, neighbors had hung yellow ribbons and welcome home banners on their porch. Someone had left a bag of dog treats tied with a bow. Coda sniffed at it and wagged his tail, but waited for Emily's nod before touching it. Always disciplined, even at home. Inside the house, sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. Everything was exactly as they'd left it. The framed photos, the stack of unopened mail, the smell of cedar from John's old footlocker. Emily walked room to room, touching the furniture as if to reassure herself it was real. John stood in the doorway watching her. "Feels like another life," he said quietly. "It is," she said. He crossed to her and pulled her into an embrace. For a long moment they just breathed together, the rhythm of two people who had learned to survive storms. That evening they invited only a handful of close friends, fellow SEALs, Emily's sister, a neighbor who'd watered their plants, for a small gathering. No media, no microphones, just people who'd stood by them when everything fell apart. On the patio, strings of lights glowed softly against the dark. Someone grilled steaks, children ran in the yard. Coda sat like a sentinel by the back fence, but his tail wagged every time a child darted past. One of John's teammates raised a glass. "To Carter," he said. "And to Emily and Coda. You fought back with truth." Everyone clinked glasses. Emily felt tears sting her eyes but blinked them away. She didn't want pity, only the quiet acknowledgement of people who understood. Later, when the guests were gone and the house was silent again, John stood at the window looking out at the night. "What happens now?" Emily asked softly. He turned. "The DOJ will open a case against Stonebridge. They'll probably call me to testify. We'll have to go public." Emily joined him at the window. "We'll do it together." John's eyes met hers. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." She smiled faintly. "We're a team." Down by her feet, Coda thumped his tail once, as if to say, "Don't forget me." In the days that followed, their lives became a strange blend of normality and notoriety. News crews camped at the end of their street. Coda's photo appeared on magazine covers. A major late-night host called him the four-legged whistleblower. A veterans charity started a fundraiser in his name. But behind the headlines, Emily and John focused on healing. They went on long walks with Coda through the wooded trails near their home. They cooked simple meals. They sat on the porch at night without speaking, listening to the crickets, relearning what quiet felt like. Emily noticed changes in John. His shoulders gradually loosened. His eyes softened. He started smiling more, real smiles, not the tight, wary expressions from the trial. He even laughed once when Coda chased a squirrel and fell into a pile of leaves. For Emily, the nightmares that had haunted her, the courtroom, the gunfire, the fear of losing him, began to fade. She started writing in a journal again, recording the story not as a legal case but as a human journey. She wanted to remember every detail of how they'd fought back and won. A week later, a letter arrived from Judge Harrington himself, hand-signed on official stationery. Emily unfolded it at the kitchen table, John leaning over her shoulder. It was brief but powerful. "Mrs. Carter, in decades on the bench, I have rarely witnessed such courage, composure, and loyalty as you displayed in my courtroom. Your actions may have changed not only the outcome of one trial, but the culture of accountability around it. Please extend my respect to your husband and to Coda, whose discipline was extraordinary. Hunan. Robert Harrington." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. "He didn't have to write this," she said softly. John squeezed her shoulder. "He meant it," she crouched to show Coda. "You hear that? The judge likes you." Coda licked her hand once, solemnly. That night, Emily dreamed of the courtroom, but this time, not as a nightmare. She saw herself giving the quiet command, saw Coda moving like a shadow, saw the flash drive gleaming in the light. In the dream, she felt no fear, only purpose. When she woke, John was beside her, breathing evenly. She reached for his hand in the dark and felt him squeeze back. "We're safe," she whispered. For the first time in months, she believed it. 6 months later, the snow had melted from the lawns of Virginia, and spring sunlight streamed through the windows of the Carters' modest home. The once intense swirl of media had faded to a low hum. The trial of Stonebridge Global Security executives was underway in a federal court, and John had become a key witness, not as a defendant this time, but as a whistleblower. Emily sat at her desk by the window, looking over the manuscript she'd been writing for months. The working title sat bold on the first page, "The Quiet Command." She smiled faintly at the phrase. It was no longer just the name of one moment in a courtroom. It had become a symbol of everything they'd endured. Discipline, loyalty, and the courage to act when it mattered. Outside, John was in the yard running drills with Coda. Though officially retired from active duty, John had kept their training sessions, turning them into a form of therapy and bonding. Coda, older now but still powerful, sprinted across the lawn to retrieve a dummy flash drive John had hidden under a bucket. He came back at a steady trot, eyes bright. Emily could hear John's laugh through the open window. She turned back to her manuscript, fingers poised over the keyboard. She began to type. People think courage is a roar. Sometimes it's just a whisper, or a quiet command given to a loyal friend who listens. Later that day, the three of them drove to a veterans rehabilitation center on the outskirts of town. Since the trial, Emily and John had dedicated much of their time to working with veterans and service animals. Coda had become the face of a new program, pairing retired combat dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD. The program's slogan was printed on a banner hanging over the entrance. Healing together. As they walked in, staff and patients greeted Coda like a celebrity. The dog accepted pats and scratches calmly, eyes flicking back to Emily for reassurance. John met with a small group of veterans, speaking quietly about his experience, not glamorizing it, but telling the truth. Emily ran a workshop for spouses, teaching them about support networks and training techniques for service dogs. During a break, a young Marine approached Emily. His hands trembled slightly, a service dog at his side. "Ma'am," he said softly, "your story, it gave me hope. I was starting to think no one could fight the system and win." Emily smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're never alone," she said. "And sometimes your best ally is right at your feet." The Marine's dog wagged his tail. Emily crouched to scratch behind its ears. "Good boy," she whispered, the phrase now like a secret handshake between those who understood. That evening, back at home, John received a call from the lead federal prosecutor handling the Stonebridge case. "We've secured convictions on 2 executives," the voice said. "Your testimony was crucial. We're moving forward with more indictments." John hung up and met Emily's eyes. "It's happening," he said. "They're paying for what they did." Emily felt a quiet satisfaction, but also a sobering weight. Justice was never clean, but at least now it was real. She poured them both a glass of wine, and they went out onto the porch. Coda lay at their feet, head on his paws, watching the sunset blaze orange across the horizon. John broke the silence. "Do you ever miss it?" "The action?" Emily considered. "I miss the clarity, but I don't miss the cost." He nodded slowly. "Me too." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "This," she said softly, "is enough." In the months that followed, the Quiet Command manuscript became a published book. It debuted to strong reviews and an outpouring of support from military families. Emily was invited to speak at conferences about resilience and the role of service animals. John appeared on panels about accountability and ethics in private military contracting. But perhaps their proudest moment came at a small ceremony on a warm June morning. Judge Harrington, now retired, attended quietly as a guest of honor. Veterans lined the stage. Children waved flags. And at the center, Coda sat with a new vest embroidered with gold thread. Service and truth. Emily took the microphone. "When we walked into that courtroom, we were scared, outnumbered, and almost out of hope. But we had one thing no one could take from us, our bond. A husband, a wife, and a dog who refused to be silent. We gave a quiet command and it changed everything." The crowd applauded. John squeezed her hand. Coda barked once, as if on cue, and the audience laughed and clapped harder. After the ceremony, Judge Harrington shook John's hand. "You've turned a tragedy into a legacy," he said quietly. "That's rare." John nodded. "We couldn't have done it without Emily and Coda." The judge crouched to scratch Coda behind the ears. "And without this one," he said with a smile. That night, back at home, Emily placed Coda's new vest on a hook near the door. She ran her hand over the embroidery, feeling the texture of the letters. She thought of all the nights of fear, the endless hearings, the cold marble of the courtroom. And then she thought of the flash drive in her palm, the moment when everything shifted because she had acted, and because Coda had answered. John came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Just thinking how far we've come." He kissed her temple. "And how far we can go." They stood like that for a long moment, Coda at their feet, the 3 of them bathed in the soft light of their kitchen. Outside, the world went on, messy and unpredictable, but inside they were steady, like a small team holding its ground. As the seasons changed, their story became less about scandal and more about inspiration. Schools invited them to talk about integrity. Police academies studied the courtroom footage as an example of discipline under pressure. Veterans groups named scholarships after Coda, and slowly, the phrase "the quiet command" entered the public lexicon, not just as a book title, but as a shorthand for courage that doesn't shout. Emily would sometimes wake before dawn and find John and Coda already outside, running drills or just walking the perimeter of their yard. She'd stand at the window, coffee in hand, and watch them. Two warriors, one human, one canine, moving in silent synchronization. And she'd feel the same surge of gratitude she'd felt that day in the courtroom. For loyalty. For truth. For the quiet moments that change everything. On a warm autumn evening, Emily sat at her desk again, finishing a new chapter for the paperback edition of her book. She wrote, "Courage is not a roar. Courage is a hand reaching down to stroke a dog's head before you give the command. Courage is standing up when you're terrified. Courage is trusting the bond you've built when no one else believes you." She saved the document and closed the laptop. Outside, John whistled softly and Coda bounded up the porch steps, panting, eyes bright. Emily opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. The three of them stood together under the stars, not as victims, not as fugitives, but as a family who had taken their quiet command and turned it into a legacy. Coda sat, tail flicking once. "Mission complete,"